people love to daydream about what they call traditional gender roles. And I say, well, the trouble, what people generally referring to there is something from in the arc from about 1850 to 1950, where sex roles were there was a male breadwinner and notionally a female private domestic bourgeois housewife. And this is a pattern which looms very large in both the right and the left imaginary for different reasons, although they disagree about what it means. But that's what people mean when they talk about traditional gender roles. And my critique of that is not that it's traditional, but it's not traditional enough. And I think we should go back to something. I think if we want a template to model what we could do more healthily from where we are now, rather than where we were between 1850 and 1950, we might look considerably further back at productive households. And consider whether there's any of the affordances of the 21st century might bring us closer to that kind of a model, and offer new ways of working together, in such as to create more space for family and different ways of working, and more creative solutions to the problem of who does what and where and when, and more flexible solutions to that than a fantasized return to a past whose material conditions are just dead and gone now anyway.
Yes. I believe what has happened is we have made a classic error of progressives faced with a complex problem. And I don't mean complicated, I mean complex in the technical sense, which is one cannot anticipate the consequences of a change in a truly complex adaptive environment. And instead of behaving with caution when we upend something major, like, for example, we introduce technological birth control that is sufficient for meaningful family planning, we do not then carefully monitor the impact on things that we have separately decided are valuable, so that we can discover if we've made an error, if there's a refinement that is necessary, right? If there's some way to balance the costs and benefits. Instead, what we have done is we've entered an era of what Heather and I call hypernovelty, where the rate of change is so fast that not only are you not trained for the world in which you become an adult, because that world literally didn't exist when you were young, but the rate of change is so high that it is not even in principle within the capacity of selection to keep up. Right? You don't run a scientific experiment by changing 100 things at once and then trying to figure out which thing affected what. You change one thing at a time. And in our culture, it's not even 100 things at once. It's everything is being altered all the time around us, which means these utterly profound changes, their impacts can't be tracked because they're buried in statistical noise of all sorts of other changes that had impacts, many of which will be trivial, but can't be isolated.
Yeah. In my gloomier moments, Brett, I look at the collapsing birth rate across the developed and increasingly also the developing world. And I think, well, you could, if you were feeling pessimistic, you could just see this as a form of evolutionary feedback. It just says, this is just not a way of living which is conducive to its perpetuating itself.
Yeah.
And something is going to have to shift, or it just isn't going to.
Well, but here's the ultimate problem here. On the one hand, I'm tempted to draw that same connection, and I resist doing it because I believe that if that is what's going on, it's really, that almost sounds like a kind of evolutionary wisdom, which I'm convinced it isn't. I'm convinced it's more like a system that is incoherent, does not send the right messages to the body that cause it to be in a reproductive, physiologically reproductive mode. And so it would be almost happenstance that our chaos is triggering that mechanism rather than wisdom. But what is ordinarily true in human evolution is that at any one moment, some lineage may experiment with something radically different. And that radically different thing may provide a benefit. More often than not, it will be negative. And that lineage can either reverse course when it realizes that what it's doing has not been a net benefit, or it can go extinct and be replaced by others that didn't take that path. And unfortunately, our modern our hyper novel world that we moderns live in has linked us all together. So instead of the culture having an outburst of feminism to which many people opted out, it sort of took over the whole culture, which did not leave a population to which to compare, right? And that is increasingly a global problem where, because the internet takes every idea and spreads it almost everywhere instantaneously, we're sort of all dragged into the same experiment over and over again. And there's no capability to say, well, here's what you imagined was going to happen downstream of that change, and here's what actually happened. And maybe it wasn't as good an idea as you thought.
Yeah, certainly. Liberating the world's information has had some unexpected side effects. I definitely agree with that. I don't know. I look at the way the internet is evolving, and which is also happening just incredibly, mind-bogglingly fast. And there are all sorts of doomer scenarios floating around at the moment with artificial intelligence and so on. But I think it's not impossible that people will regain a measure of, well, that the internet will become semi-deliberately much more siloed over time, and that because people realize that just everybody being networked in that way just isn't good. In fact, I would argue that it's probably already happening. I mean, there was a point, I think, probably from the late noughties up to about Trump's election year, give or take, maybe a bit beyond that, where everybody really did have all of their conversations in public on the internet, and I just don't think that's the case anymore. There are too many hallway monitors, and there are too many ways that you can face negative consequences for things that you say to the wrong audience on the internet. And most serious conversations now happen in gate-kept communities, and I think that will just go on happening, and subcultures will find ways of diverging again. In my observation, that's already taking place to an extent. So again, I'm not without hope that people and cultures will adapt beyond that sort of pathological state of openness. And I sincerely hope that we do, because if not, then we face the problem that you described.
Yes, although, look, I desperately want to sign on to the hope that you keep returning to. And, I have my own reasons for hope, I guess. But what I'm concerned about is that siloing, while you could imagine a productive version of it, and in fact, what I would advocate for any young person who hears a conversation like this one and thinks, oh, well, what am I to do? My suggestion would be to find a community of people to opt out of the modern sensibilities together, right? One would need to figure out what the new rules of sex and sexuality ought to be in a community that intends to function, that does value family, that also values meaningful liberation, not just trivial liberation. And, opt out together is really what I would hope to see, which is another way of describing siloing. My concern is you do a pretty good job of articulating the misleading of young people that is taking place, as the example you used was a libertarian approach to the sex industry.
It's genuinely shocking to me that there are now courses for freshers for freshman students at university on starting an OnlyFans or engaging even in real life sex work. I find that just mind-bogglingly appalling.
Right,
just beyond wrong.
I do too. And I also find the connection to libertarianism both wrong-headed and deeply unfortunate, because what it does is it turns that into a pseudo-sophistication. And the problem, and I'm sure you have found the same, is when you try to make the counter-argument, it is understood to be born of prudishness, right? Now, in my case, I don't feel that that is an accurate evaluation at all. In fact, I would argue that the problem, and I know you feel similarly, the problem is that we are not treating sex as extremely special, that it is an extremely special thing, and we have trivialized it. And it is the trivialization of sex that results in us commodifying it. So it isn't prudishness. It's actually, if sex positivity wasn't already a polluted term, you might describe this view that sex is very special as sex positivity. But this is a long way of saying, I think, unfortunately, young people who have not lived long enough to develop wisdom are easily tricked, and that whether it is, the industry doing the tricking, or wealthy men on the take, or whatever it is, or on the make, I should say, whatever it is, there's an awful lot of bandwidth being spent tricking young people into a false sophistication around sex and sexuality that then unfortunately requires recovery later, rather than, as you are hoping, that there's a silo where people who wish to opt out of that nonsense can go from the beginning.
Yeah, I think what's particularly fascinating about what you call the sort of false sense of sophistication about sex and sexuality is that it's arrived, as far as I can make out from the data, in tandem with an absolute drop in people having sex in real life, which is on the face of it, it's a really interesting paradox. Because on the one hand, you've got all of these people who are identifying as demisexual or bisexual or ace, arrow, or whatever they've come up with this week. You're coming up with increasingly baroque and fine-grained terms to define their own sexualities. But on the other hand, they've probably never had sex with anybody. And the age of loss of virginity is going up. Some, plenty of kids just, the kids are not doing it. They're not getting it on. And it's difficult to avoid the conclusion that what they're actually describing when they identify as this or that sexuality is their acquired porn preferences. Because it's very difficult to see where else they might have been getting this information from, such as to be able to come up with these hyper specific ideas of who and what they are and who and what their orientation is. I mean, and as you rightly say, it's a deeply troubling foundation for any sort of realistic prospect of forming a long-term relationship. If in fact you're setting out to create a social and a cultural or even a political identity from sexual preferences which haven't emerged, out of nothing. They haven't emerged from, as it were, from a blank slate. They've been inculcated, more often than not via porn consumption or via the sort of mimetic influence of their peers. And you think this stuff is all sloshing around, and it's increasing, and it's ever less grounded in any actual physical desires. It's not grounded in eros. It's not grounded in any sort of an I vow encounter with an actual physical desiring other. This is all happening purely in the realm of idea. And you think, well, how do you even get from doing that at the age of 15 to forming a long-term relationship at some unspecified point in the future? How do you make that transition? And I mean, sure, when I had crushes as a teenager, and it was all extremely abstract, but there wasn't this additional layer of social and political meaning making that was able to accrue around that and then persist into adult life. And yeah, I mean, I've been honestly amused, Brett, to find myself being the more optimistic side of our conversation, because I'm usually the doomer and I leave people feeling deeply miserable. So I'm kind of enjoying being the Pollyanna on this occasion. But yeah, on this, I'm as troubled as you. I'm deeply worried about what it is that we're doing. what it is that we're doing to the kids who grow up on the internet and to the kids who grow up in the pervasively pornified universe. I mean, you hear horror stories about 15-year-old girls who are so badly injured after seeking to imitate acts that they'd seen in porn footage that they'll now need a colostomy bag for life. I mean, truly horrific injuries are coming downstream of this because people just don't make the connection. They're trying to enact something which is never meant to be enacted, and they're trying to enact something which is only ever meant to be an idea. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, as you say, what it's for, what we evolved it for, has become completely lost. And I think, a challenge which I suspect is pretty near the root of this, is that the moment you push back and you say, well, can we talk about what it's actually for, which is to say, heterosexual reproduction, desire is there fundamentally to make more humans, then people, the pushback that you'll get from the progressive side on that is you'll be called heterosexist, you'll be called patriarchal, you'll be called any number of other boo words, all of which really boil down to a horror at being reminded of our embodied reality and the immutable nature of our embodied reality. And to me, violently, just an unhinged aversion to being reminded that we can't in fact escape our embodied nature.